Hello, and welcome back to the B to 3 podcast. Hi guys, my name is Liran and I am a pediatric speech language pathologist, and you are back with the B to 3 Squad podcast, your one-stop shop for all things related to the development of children between the ages of birth to 3 years old. The goal of this podcast is to share knowledge and ideas that can help support the development of children in this age group using a more holistic approach. What do I mean by that? Most professionals that help children with their development get specific training in their field, which results in helping or treating one or maybe two areas of development. For example, as a speech therapist, I might help a child with expressive language or with their feeding skills, or maybe both at the same time. But I would probably be able to help this child even more if I understood the contributing factors for the delay. For example, if I help little Johnny with his chewing skills, but I'm not aware that he was seen by a physical therapist that noticed he has low tone. That is a crucial piece of the puzzle that I'm missing. Or another example might be if I'm helping little Amy with her receptive skills or her understanding, for example, pointing to body parts that I name. But Amy actually never isolated her finger to a point. So I would probably have unrealistic expectations from Amy, and Amy would probably continue to struggle with the skill. And that is where collaborating with other disciplines makes a huge difference. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to introduce my collaboration for today. We welcome Aviva to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. Aviva is an occupational therapist. She has experience working with children under the age of 3. And that's kind of like your targeted population, right? So Aviva is here to explain to us, what is occupational therapy? What in the world is that term? Because I do hear a lot of people using the word OT, which is short for occupational therapy. And are you the person who's going to help my baby find their calling in life? Are you going to tell me which occupation my baby should be engaging in down the line?
So maybe that's the first misconception that I can clear up. No, I'm not here to help your baby get a job. Occupational therapy is a really, really broad topic, but if we want to simply define it, an occupational therapist is a person who helps people do the things that they want and need to do. Those are your occupations. And so when we think about B to 3, right, those 0 to 3 population kiddos, their occupations are things like playing with toys and learning how to participate in the routines of the day and learning how to interact with peers in their environment in healthy ways.
So if my child's occupation is to play, what would I be looking for in order to make that connection, whether or not my child needs occupational therapy?
So I think we want to be really careful. We don't want to say that there's any one specific behavior or situation that's going to say a child definitely needs to receive occupational therapy. But if we were to think again about those occupations that you might see your kiddos engaged in, so that might be playing with blocks or exploring Play-Doh, if they're having trouble coordinating their movements to play with those blocks or lift that spoon up to their mouth, or they're so sensitive to certain textures that they won't let you dress them in certain clothing, or they won't explore toys like Play-Doh or kinetic sand, those might be indications that it's worth to look into more whether an occupational therapist could be appropriate for your family to at least speak to, if not for your child to receive therapy.
Okay. So, you mentioned some of the play activities that typically children under the age of 3 would engage in, building blocks. You talked about some self-help routines. Is it all hand related? Is it all activities that require them to use their hands for self-help?
That's a really great question. I think that occupational therapists, a lot of times we get connected to the hand. There are some occupational therapists who do specialize in hand therapy. I think a lot of times our hands become one of the ways of showing how we complete an occupation. So some occupations don't require the use of the hands at all, but many, many occupations that are especially skilled will require the use of the hands. That being said, there are tons of things that OTs work on that are not specifically hand related. I did happen to mention some play routines that we do with our hands or self-help skills that we'll use our hands for, but we also will do a lot of things in the realm of helping children build attention, working on things like exploring environments, be that with the hand or just even tolerating textures or sensations or sounds or fabrics. And that can be either with the hands or just with any other part of the body.
So if my child refuses to use their hands for a certain activity, whether or not it's using Play-Doh or touching their food or making a tower of Duplo blocks, if I see them having difficulty or refusing to do so, should my first phone call be to an occupational therapist?
It could be, but I think it's also important for a parent to look at the larger context of things, right? Nothing happens in a vacuum. We're all sensory beings, and we're all just beings in general, and we're allowed to have our preferences, our likes and our dislikes. And so we might run into a child who, even at a year old, doesn't like the way that velvet feels or doesn't like the sensation of being in the sandbox. And if that child really shows that to you only in those limited situations and it doesn't affect the rest of their day, it might not be necessary to follow up with therapy. But if your child doesn't like a certain sensation and it affects their whole day, they can't get in the car because the fabric you have on the seats in the car is so uncomfortable to them, or they won't go to school on Tuesdays because sometimes their daycare teacher will take out Play-Doh on Tuesdays. That's an indication that their dysregulation or their discomfort around a specific sensory stimuli is affecting them enough that a professional might be a good person to talk to.
And what are those responses going to look like? So if my child, is refusing to take part in some of those activities, what type of response would be something that might be alarming? Children around that age, their favorite word is no. I don't want to do that. So are there behaviors that seems to correlate more with that type of resistance?
I think, right, as a parent, you're an expert on your child. So you know what your child's kind of homeostasis, their most comfortable position to be in is. So if you see that your child, who's typically a pretty good-natured, easygoing child, resists an activity, says no mommy, maybe stomps their foot and then moves on, probably pretty typical behavior in the birth to 3, especially in maybe that 1.5 to 3-year-old range.
Right.
If you are typically happy, mild-mannered, good-natured child, become so upset that they throw really an unprecedented tantrum, or they're avoiding things that they would typically enjoy because of a certain experience or situation, that's an indication that something bigger might be going on.
That actually reminds me of a time where my, son was in daycare. I think it was about 2 years old. It was my first child. So, as a parent, you're always apprehensive about introducing new skills. You definitely get desensitized with your second or third or fourth child. I remember the daycare teacher told me that he really doesn't like to play with Play-Doh. And my first reaction was, well, I haven't really given him the opportunity. That just wasn't a play activity that I introduced yet. So when we talk about children who might need occupational therapy, how would you make that distinction between a child that truly needs professional intervention versus a child that just wasn't given the opportunity?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think that it really falls to that parent to say, have I given this a fair shot? Have I tried this? Right? I have had many opportunities to work with a lot of different families, a lot of different situations. And I've had situations where I've been called because mom fed the child yogurt on Monday and she didn't like it. And so on Tuesday, the occupational therapist was called. And that's a time where I'm happy to talk to the family, give them strategies. My favorite thing to do is to work with families, but they may not have needed me. Then there are situations that I've been in where I get the phone call from a family. Hi, I've been trying to put cotton leggings on my daughter for 2 months and she still won't let me. I think we need some help. And that's a place where I'm probably the great person to call.
Right, right. And some of these things, we talked a little bit about play activities. There are milestones that are related to play. So something like stacking a tower of blocks, inserting a puzzle piece. Those are probably things that the child is exposed to on a daily basis, right? You do have that puzzle in the playroom and the blocks are always there. And if you're seeing a struggle over a longer period of time and the child is really not making progress, then you might want to have a professional take a look at that.
Absolutely. And I think it also becomes a question of, if you as a parent can identify what it is that your child is struggling with, you can already start to look in that direction. If you see that your child is struggling for a certain amount of time and you're kind of unsure of what it is that your child is in fact struggling with, you see that they're not quite able to complete the puzzle, but you're not sure what about it is challenging or why it is that they're having trouble completing it, that's a time that reaching out to an occupational therapist can be really useful.
Once I do make that call and I do see an occupational therapist, what are some of the tools that specifically an occupational therapist can share that would support the development of children, under the age of 3?
So occupational therapists, really, we can bring a lot to the table. Some of the biggest things being some creativity and some flexibility in our approach to these different occupations. Two of the areas that I feel really passionately about would be the areas of activity analysis, which is really a fancy way of saying breaking down the steps of a task. So in the example I gave earlier of a child who is having trouble doing puzzles, but you're not sure why, doing something like activity analysis, breaking down the steps of a task to really look, oh, is that child having trouble picking up the pieces of the puzzle? Or I worked with one family where picking up the pieces was no problem whatsoever, but the little girl was actually having trouble really fitting the pieces into the puzzle board. We were able to look really specifically at certain parts of the activity to really find what was challenging and then to help her build success. Another area that I feel really passionately about is adapting the environment, right? So that's making simple modifications to the place that your child would be in during these activities and helping them to use the space differently. So I have worked with families, or a specific family that I'm thinking of actually, where the child was doing a really great job of playing with adults. When adult-led play was occurring, the child was really a rock star. But then when mom would try to have the child engage in more of that independent play, he would get really distracted and would have a hard time finding what to do. And so by adapting his environment, simplifying the number of activities that were available to him, having less distractions around, having more toys and activities kind of contained in boxes and containers, we were able to see that he was able to focus more on one activity at a time and he was able to play more successfully independently.
And are those things that you find parents to kind of be able to carry out outside of occupational therapy session? Me as a parent who maybe now for the first time realizes what occupational therapy is and what are the tools and strategies, could I help my child do the same thing that the occupational therapist is doing later that day or the next day?
Absolutely. I think any professional, be they an OT, a PT, or a physical therapist, a speech language pathologist, so many different, professionals that you might work with in the birth to 3 range, anything that they teach you should be something that you as a parent can carry over, should be something that you as a parent can do. So if you're going to work with an OT, the goal would be and the hope would be that they would give you a strategy. Hey, let me show you how to do it the first time so you can do it the second time. Let me show you how to do it with one activity so you can do it with the second activity.
Full disclosure, before I worked with a multidisciplinary team, I had really a very narrow view of what occupational therapy is. My first interaction with an occupational therapist was actually in a school setting. So I did an internship in a school for kids with learning disabilities, and the occupational therapist was there to help with grasping the pencil the right way, or I think they also had help with matching a fidget to a child that might needed some sort of a distraction or being able to focus in the classroom setting. Only once I teamed up with other disciplines like occupational therapists, within the age group of birth to 3, I realized there's such a range of skills that an occupational therapist can help with. And ideally, if you do work in an environment where you are part of a team, of this information occupational therapy can bring to the table helps other disciplines and helps other professionals facilitating skills that might not be directly related to occupational therapy. So if I'm thinking of an example, speech therapy can help with language, and there's also the feeding aspect. So if we do come in and we help the child with increasing their vocabulary or the mechanism of chewing, there are so many contributing factors to why that kid might be struggling. And when you are trained in only kind of like your lane and only what you know, you can really kind of help the child only in that aspect.
It maybe narrows your focus sometimes.
Right. And once you get additional information, you're able to see the child in a more holistic way, which is what we mentioned when I first started the episode. And then once you have more information, you're able to facilitate greater progress in many areas and not just the one you were working on.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think when I do have the opportunity to work on collaborative teams and to, have my little powwows with the speech language pathologist or the physical therapist, hey, like, what is our ultimate goal here? Oh, we're trying to get really mature chewing. Maybe I'm working with the speech language pathologist. Okay, let's think about, does this child have full tolerance of textures? Maybe I'm going to come in and do my session and work on sensory play. We're going to touch some different textures. We're going to put our hands in some slimy things, some mushy things, some chewy things. Or maybe I'm going to cook with this child depending on their age and level of function. Maybe I'm going to cook with them. And then maybe the speech language pathologist is going to come for their session next. And they're going to eat with the child. They're going to practice that chewing. We have the opportunity to just build something really beautiful and global.
Right. So that team approach is definitely, again, if you're lucky enough to have a team, if your child needs a team, I think teaming up with the parent could only do good for the child, right? Another example that I could think about is, when I worked in a daycare setting. In a daycare setting, there's just so much going on. It's such a hectic environment that it's really hard to tease apart what is affecting what. I worked with a child that was very verbal, but actually one of the reasons that I was there is because there were biting incidences. And the parent was under the impression that, the child is not using their language to communicate that they want the toy, and the child would bite. So once I got in there and, kind of did my assessment and did my observation, I realized that child had plenty of language and could definitely use words to kind of fight for what they want. But there was a proximity issue. Once other kids got in their space, that kind of triggered the biting. Now, mind you, I'm a speech therapist and I'm not really getting any kind of training on those specific behaviors. And that's what they are. They're behaviors. And the hat that I put on is language. I eventually figured out that perhaps an occupational therapist is the right person to come in and take a look at that. But I thought to myself, if I struggle to kind of pinpoint what is going on here and who's the right person to call, then I can't imagine a parent who has a daycare director addressing an issue that they're having with a child. And, some of these daycares are not really, they don't really tolerate those kind of behaviors. Yeah. So like your child is biting, you might need to seek another daycare. It could be a head scratcher. I guess if there is the opportunity, making those connections and seeking an additional, before you even talk about therapy, just additional information.
When in doubt, OT it out, right? There are certain professions that have their names in the title. You're a speech language pathologist. Speech is right there in the name. OT is a little bit of a misnomer because the word occupation doesn't conjure up the idea of a child in a daycare setting.
Right.
But if you think you need some help and you're not sure who to call, I would say maybe not 9 times out of 10, but maybe 7 times out of 10, an OT is a good first resource even if all they can do is point you in the direction of the next person. Because we're these kind of jack of all trades generalists that are looking at a lot of areas of child development, we're also a good place to say, oh, this isn't me, but I know who it is. This isn't something I can help you with, but I know somebody who can.
Right. And that's just another resource, right? So what do you think is unique to the birth to 3 population in regards to occupational therapy? Why would that be a good time to seek that type of resource if I feel like my child might need that?
So we learn things throughout our lives, right? Humans are always growing and adapting and changing. But really, so much of the foundation of the people that we will become is laid in the first 3 or so years of development, in that 0 to 3 age range. And when a child learns to do things and learns to do things successfully and gains mastery of activities, they learn so much, not just about the activities that they're actually engaged in, but in the world as a whole, in their sense of self, of who they are in the world. What is their role or their purpose in the world? It's a beautiful thing to see. I think most people who have the opportunity to interact with children, either as professionals or as just the people who love them, as moms and dads and aunts and uncles and best friends and cousins and whoever else, we've all seen a child do something for the first time, and we've seen their faces just like light up with joy because we're seeing that child realize who they are. And that's an amazing thing. And now sometimes we have kiddos who aren't able to do that. And for whatever reason, they're not able to independently gain those feelings of mastery and self-discovery that really lay the foundation for the agency and efficacy that they'll feel as they age. And so it's at that point that I think it's so vital to reach out to whoever's going to be on your professional team. And obviously, I think that should include an occupational therapist, to reach out and to say, hey, I don't want to miss this opportunity. I don't want my child to be at risk for not having the opportunity to develop all of these beautiful skills.
Right. So, that I think we're going to talk a lot about that in almost every episode of this podcast, is that word opportunity.
Yeah.
A lot of times, especially as a first-time parent, you are nervous about introducing a new skill. You might not think, you might think that the child is too young. You might feel like you're not ready. Maybe the child is ready, but you're not ready as the parent. Sometimes any professional could kind of give you that confidence. Yeah, your child.
It's time. We're here. We're ready.
Right. And even if they're not ready, it's never too early to introduce the skill. It doesn't mean that the child needs to master the skill right away. An example that comes to mind, and I think that's where occupational therapy and speech therapy overlaps very early on, is babies who are supposed to hold their bottle. I might introduce that skill when the child is 1 month old. I might put their hands on the bottle while I'm feeding them, not because I'm expecting them to do that on their own the following week, but because I want to introduce the skill. So then it's much easier down the line when it is the right time to have my baby hold their bottle, to just naturally do that.
We always want to lay that foundation, right? Rome is not built in a day. Achieving a skill is not built in a day. If we introduce these things to our little ones before they need to do them, I have worked with a lot of families in a lot of the arena of self-help particularly, and I've spoken to so many parents. Yeah, I know your child does not need to spoon feed themselves today, but I know you, and I know you're going to want them to do this in 6 months from now. So we start today. We practice today so that we can build that mastery in 6 months or in a year or whatever the case may be.
Right. And an introduction might require a lot of adult guidance at first, right? If I'm putting my baby's hands on the bottle and I'm holding and putting my hand over their hand, I am doing most of the work, but I'm still introducing the fundamentals of that skill. If we are talking about using a spoon, there's so much research on just how to introduce utensils by just having them around. Let them play with utensils. Let it be part of bath time routines.
You're making me think of a particular family that I worked with that I just adored. And if you can figure out who you are, I'm talking about you and I love you. And the parents were so concerned. How do we make utensil use positive for our child? They had an older child who hated using utensils well into his middle childhood years, and they really wanted to get it right with the little one. And their answer to that was to give him, I'm telling you, 10 forks and spoons at one mealtime.
Wow.
And so the child was having a great time playing with utensils. But we were running into consistently the issue, he's not using utensils, he's playing because he has 10 forks and spoons in front of him. So by taking a step back and being open to my suggestions, being a little bit flexible with some of the things that I had to say, we were able to simplify that to say, hey, maybe it's time to provide just one utensil. Or maybe we're going to give a choice of 2 utensils, but we're going to slow it down. We're going to try something different. We were actually able to find more success for this little one.
Wow. And again, I feel like the parent could probably figure that out at some point, but having someone holding your hand and kind of...
It makes it easier. 2 heads are always better than one. What a parent can come up with at 3 o'clock in the morning after 2 sleepless nights can just feel very different than what can be figured out over a cup of tea and a chat with a professional.
Right. And that's priceless, really, because if you feel like you have resources, then you feel less disabled yourself. You know, we all want to help our kids with mastering any kind of skill. But if I don't know how to help my child, then I might feel frustrated as the parent. And then that frustration could definitely be picked up by my child, and then everybody's unhappy.
No, and ultimately, as much as we're always here for the kiddos, your professionals are always here to support you as the parents, right? And we want to, I think a lot of families might feel concerned, oh, if I reach out to an occupational therapist, it means my child needs to receive occupational therapy. And there are plenty of times where that's not the case, where a parent needs a consult, a parent needs a fresh set of eyes or a new perspective, or just acclimation to other opportunities or other options that might be available. But it doesn't mean that your child is going to need ongoing therapy. It's just the opportunity to speak to a professional. When our cars need to be serviced, some brave individuals will try to do that themselves, but we all feel very comfortable to touch base with our mechanic. You can think of these professionals like the OT or whoever it might be as your touch-base professionals, not just as your long-term specialists.
Right. Do you have, or do you think that there is a particular memorable moment, or is there a specific moment between the interaction, between you and the parent that is the most significant?
Something that I really love to see is watching the parent's face relax. I've done a lot of home care in my career, and I continue to do a lot of home care. And so often in those first few sessions, I'm sitting on the floor playing with a child. That's usually pretty consistent throughout any of my treatment sessions. But at first, I'll sit on the floor and play with a child, and mom's back tends to be very straight, or dad tends to sit there. Maybe he even has a notepad. He's taking some notes. And then as time goes on, maybe I see like mom or dad relax. And I can think of one specific family where I remember the first time that they had an open concept home, but mom stepped into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. And I remember noticing that and thinking, she's comfortable enough to take her eyes off for a moment. She's still very present and participatory in the session, but she's relaxed enough to get a drink of water. And those moments have been really profound. I love my work with my kiddos, but it's watching the families change a little bit and seeing them become more comfortable or more secure. That's been just really remarkable.
Right. And I think that's the privilege of working with children, working with families. It can be very emotionally rewarding.
Ultimately, like, what could be better than a happy parent and a happy child?
That's the goal, for
Always.
sure.
I've also enjoyed, there was a particular story we worked for a really long time on helping a little girl build hand strength. Mom wanted her to do a lot of things, including unfastening the Velcro on her shoes. And I will never forget the text message. Little girl finally learned how to open her shoes. She threw them at me while I was driving. That was a great one too.
I think those are memorable moments for pretty much any parent. So on that positive note, we are going to wrap things up for today. But I do want to thank Aviva for coming in and clarifying what occupational therapy is.
Thank you so much for having me. Such a pleasure. Anybody who's not sure, right? When in doubt, OT it out.
Right. And that's when we also want to remind everyone to please comment, like, subscribe, and of course, share. I mean, that is the whole goal of this podcast. Knowledge is power. And if you know anybody that might benefit from learning a little bit more on how to support children between the ages of birth and 3, please send them a link to this episode. So thank you for listening, and see you next time.